It's time for the Rose Chat Podcast, a podcast dedicated to celebrating the world's most beloved flower, the rose. Join award-winning gardeners Chris VanCleave and Teresa Byington as they chat with rose lovers and experts from around the globe. With each episode, you'll gain valuable knowledge and insights to achieve the rose garden you've always dreamed of. Listen now as we explore the world of roses.
Hey, rose friends. Today, Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm is back. And today, it's all about growing roses in containers, which I know many of you are very interested in. So Jason's going to share with us some of his favorite roses to grow in containers, and he'll give us his best tips too. Hey, Jason, welcome back to Rose Chat.
Thanks so much for having me back. Thanks for the invite.
Oh, so glad to have you. Now, I don't know about there, but around here, the season is going so fast, and we're seeing blooms about 3 weeks early. So what's it like there?
I think we're probably safely about a 1 week or 2 weeks ahead. A lot of the old garden roses, the first Scots roses, are going to bloom right now. And we expect peak in the first week of June, maybe the second week of June.
Wow. Yeah, it is going early. It is exciting, but we got rose shows coming up. We kind of want to hold off just a little. This week it did get cooler and we were getting some rain. So maybe we slow down just a little. Now, speaking of your area, tell people where you're located.
We're on the west coast of Canada. So a lot of people, when they hear that I'm in Canada, will think, oh, it must be very cold out there. You must have the cold winters. We're actually zone 8, which would put us in line with coastal Texas. But most similarly, we're actually quite like Seattle or Portland. So that's our growing climate. In fact, when I went down this year to visit heirloom roses and was talking to Ben down there, really all of our concerns, even the way our seasons line up, were exactly the same. So it's very much like the coastal West Coast climate.
I've followed Ben, and we met at the Biltmore at the Rose Trials many, many years ago, and been a big supporter of all that they do. But when you were out there in the video that you did, I saw it bigger. It just seemed so big. You did some great footage of heirloom.
And they do a great job at that site, maintaining all those old collections from the Clements. Wonderful site, and they do a wonderful professional job of running that nursery. I got to meet with the growing team, and they take such care to make sure they're putting out healthy, disease-free roses. Beyond what you see, they're sanitizing their tools between each cut. They really take the extra step to make sure everything goes through healthy. So can't say enough nice things about them.
Isn't that just good to know? Many of my roses come from there, and so it is really good to know that those that are supplying the roses that we want to be beautiful in our gardens are taking such care. So let's talk about growing in containers. Seems like that's really still a big buzz. People are just very interested for many reasons. But tell us some of the benefits of growing in containers.
Well, I guess first and foremost, you'd start by talking about people who have limited in-ground gardening space. And this kind of opens up the hobby to a wider range of gardeners, but also those with accessibility issues that can't be on their hands and knees gardening or weeding, having it brought up to their level out on a deck, out on the veranda. It's a great way to garden for a big part of the public. On the other end, I would say, there are those gardeners who get the bug and have purchased tons of roses, and they kind of have that question of where do I put all of these? And putting them in containers for a while can give them the opportunity to grow them on, see what they're like, try them out in different spots, and depending on how it goes, they can put them in the garden later or decide not to grow them. So it is actually kind of a great thing benefits-wise. I will say that once you have them in a container, then you have tons of control about how they grow. So if you need to move them to a slightly shadier location, you can do that, a sunnier location. So you get tons more control. But the double-edged sword there is all the growing conditions are on you. So you really have to, you're in charge, you get all that control, but then you have to use it to grow the best roses you can. And then the other pro and con of this is that you can actually easily protect containerized roses in the winter if you have a harsh climate, but they are a little more vulnerable to cold too. So I guess that's a double-edged sword as well.
Absolutely. I remember the first time my daughter, she lived in California for many years. And I remember the first time I went there and saw how roses are grown in California. I saw that so many people with limited space grew hundreds of roses in containers. And really, the containers were all that big and the roses were huge. So definitely it is something that's an achievable goal for most of us. And I will say that you hear all the time the baby boomers are downsizing and young people are buying smaller spaces, and there's a lot of balconies and decks. And so this just fits perfectly.
Yeah, it sure does.
Now let's talk about roses that you think are great in containers. We just love to hear what other people think about some of these roses.
Oh, you bet. And I guess what I would say is when you say small containers, large roses, yeah, people can get away with that. But kind of ideally, you'd like to have a rose that is a bit on the compact size, or at least match the size of the container to the size of the rose so that it's not so challenging to grow. So I think the most natural fit for containers would be things like minis or small floribundas. In the minis, I could say a few that I love. Crackling Fire is one that I've posted on social media a number of times. Just has a beautiful darker reverse on an orange rose. Outstanding color. Scarlet Moss is a Ralph Moore rose. That's a moss rose, but it's been miniaturized. So that's kind of cool. And I will say that the Sunblaze series that's available, Amber Sunblaze, Rainbow Sunblaze, or the other rose that I was saying is Coffee Bean. So all of those minis I have in containers around my yard. And just because they perform so well in a container.
That Sunblaze series is vast. I mean, I think there's a color there for everyone.
Sure is. And moving on to the small floribundas, I'd say I have a few favorites, but the floribundas are well suited to this. So Glad Tidings is my favorite red. It just has nice. Repeat bloom, gorgeous rose. Maurisa Trillo in sort of that wild, splashy, dappled colors. Then Life of the Party has a wonderful range of colors as well, going from the pinks through the yellows and blends there. My favorite yellow, it's a toss-up. You could go with Julia Child, or I also like Arthur Bell, which has a slightly stronger fragrance to my nose, but doesn't hold its color quite so well as Julia Child. And the ever popular Beverly, which just performs so well in a container or warm climates, all sorts of climates.
Oh, Beverly. I remember Beverly was the big winner at one of the first Biltmore Rose trials when I was there a few years back. Such a pretty bloom and a nice fragrance. I think it might have won for fragrance that year. But anyway, that's a nice collection.
It sure is. And, speaking of collections, there are some breeders, and, I'll just give the example of the Veranda series, because probably by nature or by breeding, these are small floribundas, but they have been bred specifically to perform well in containers. So I love Cream Veranda, Lavender Veranda, Roxanne Veranda. That whole series is just sort of built for it. And probably there are different breeding programs that do the same thing, having ones that are sort of bred for container growing.
Oh, that Veranda series is so pretty. And that Cream Veranda caught my attention last year. And I ended up buying 2 for this year. I'm waiting on blooms, but the pictures, and same with that Lavender Veranda. I mean, those are just outstanding plants. And in that container, you can have them up close and personal to you.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't mind throwing in a word for a throwback to some older varieties. And, I love the historical roses, but going back to the Polyantha class, which is sort of a precursor to the Floribundas, there are some in that class that are wonderful for containers just because they're so small. Little White Pet comes to mind because it's bloom all the time, just constant bloom on that. Also, of course, the Fairy, which is just a standard recommendation for a compact rose. Lovely Fairy in a darker color. And I would say even I think one of the one called Orange Triumph, which I just got this year, and it's just gorgeous.
Oh, orange is just really, there's some orange roses out there knocking it out of the park. That's gotten to be very, very popular, especially with young growers. I had to look up Lovely Fairy. I had not known that one. It is beautiful. A very vibrant pink fairy rose. Very pretty.
Right, and those colors aren't for everyone, but I tend to like the saturated colors more so than the pastels. So, And then I just wanted to, I should say the small shrubs, the ones like you talked about, the Oh So Easy Paprika or the Flower Carpet series or the Drift series are, they're wonderful for the landscape, but they also do wonderfully in a small container.
Absolutely. They're just about bulletproof. I have a pink flower, I think it's bright pink flower carpet rose that I've had forever. I don't even know when or where I got it. And it's just bulletproof. It just does its thing. It's absolutely stunning. It's not in a pot. It's out in the garden, but what an easy rose. And the Drift series. I mean, a friend was just sending me pictures of her apricot drift today, and it's just stunning. You think, oh, it's a drift rose, but my goodness, they're pretty. And the sweet drift, I have a border of those, and each bloom looks like a little hybrid tea. I mean, who wouldn't want that on your patio? It's absolutely stunning. So drift, you say drift roses, you think, oh, it sounds kind of common, but boy, take a look at them. They are beautiful roses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, some of those standard landscape roses, I still get, I still grow Bonica in the yard here, and it's just, individually, if you get in there and photograph the blooms, I mean, it still holds up with some of the best of them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a beauty too. I had that years ago. I'm sure I loved it and just gave it to a friend, making room for someone else that I had to try. So I'm famous for doing that. I'm populating other gardens.
And I wouldn't mind saying that don't count out some of the larger roses. So even though up to this point I've been talking about the smaller roses, I think if you keep on sizing up the container, you can get a range even into, for instance, the David Austin roses. And there are some of them, I mean, many of the David Austins are large shrubs, but Rodal, Grace, Jubilee Celebration, all three of those could be managed for a container as long as you size up the container appropriately.
Mm-hmm. I'm hearing of a lot of people that there's a newer one out, Eustacia Vi, and I'm sure our listeners are probably getting tired of me talking about it because all I know so far is the pictures. But I have added 2 this year, and I can't wait for blooms. But I'm knowing several people that say they're growing it in Eustacia Vi in a container as well. So. And it does seem it's even growing more compact than my others, even at an early stage. They're getting big,
Mm-hmm.
and this one is definitely going to be more compact.
Oh, great! Well, you'll have to update us on that.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, I will say don't count out the hybrid teas or the grandifloras. Again, a little on the large side naturally for a small container, but something like fragrant plum, Gemini, Bolero, which I love,
Yes.
and Elle, which it's a great color blend in that one as well.
Well, Elle's been around for a while, but it is super popular right now. And I think it's just so pretty, and the nice fragrance. It's timeless, really. And everyone, including you, have convinced me I had to have Bolero. So I have 2 of them. Of course, I had to buy 2, but I cannot wait for them to bloom. But everyone who grows this one just absolutely loves it. And I don't know that there's a prettier hybrid tea anywhere than Gemini. And it's an easy one, and even though it's been around for a while. So though that's a good collection there for sure. I love that. Very nice. Let's see. Let's go to tips and tricks. You've touched on a few things, but so help us be successful.
Okay. Well, I guess one of the first questions people might have, and I did touch on the question of container size, because when you buy a rose in the store, it might be 8 inches across the pot, the diameter of the pot, or 10 inches. And that's appropriate for it while it's in the store. But once you get it home and you're trying to grow in a container, you might want to upgrade that a little bit. And what I would say is don't try going straight from that 8-inch size, for instance, all the way up to 20 or 24 inches. The plant will just be swimming in that. It will take forever for its roots to take over that container. So maybe try stepping it up from 8 inches to maybe 10 or 12, and then after you've grown it in that stage, you could stage it up to 16 inches. And I think it really does benefit the rose to not go from a very small pot to a very large pot all in one step.
It seems to me that if you go too big too, it's very hard to control moisture. It can stay wet just so long before those roots really have a chance to grow through all of that. So for lots of reasons, I think that's very appropriate to graduate the sizes and not go too big.
Right. And then now talking about the maximum size of the pot, it does depend on the size of the rose. So if you're growing something like a mini or a small rose up to about 24 inches in height, people will always ask for the specifics. How big should my pot eventually be? And I would say in the range of about 12 to 15 inches for a small rose. That might be your sort of peak size of container. And just putting that in trade gallons, something between a 5 and a 7 gallon pot might be appropriate long term for a mini rose up to about 24 inches. And when you move on to the medium roses, let's say you have a rose that grows from 24 to say 42 inches in height, I would step up the pot diameter all the way up to about 18 to 24 inches in size, up to a 15 or 25 gallon pot eventually. And if you're growing a super large rose, like you're trying to grow climbers or big shrubs, you can go beyond that. So you can go up to say 24 or 30 inches, or the sky's the limit. Really what you'll know is that when you've gotten past the point where the rose is running out of water quickly or hard to manage, if you're watering say 3 times a week, that's when you need to start considering moving up the pot size.
Excellent.
Now, inside that pot, you might be talking about which potting mix you want to put in there. And my whole point on that is just to maintain good drainage. And so you'd be looking for those potting mixes like Pro Mix HP or Pro Mix or Sunshine Mix that have the big pieces of perlite in it that help to manage the drainage. And actually, one mistake that I hear people making is that they'll line the bottom of their pot, like the bottom 3 inches or 4 inches, with coarse gravel or with broken pots and that kind of thing, thinking that's improving drainage, but actually doesn't improve the drainage. It creates kind of a perched water table above that. So you actually want the soil to go from the top to the bottom of the pot.
Oh, yeah, I totally believe in that. I've tried a few things through the years. It did not work. So I'm totally with you on that.
So I wouldn't mind on the recommending the fertilizer. There's a lot of mixed information about how you should fertilize your rose. And I see a lot of the fertilizer being recommended by everybody having a very high amount of phosphorus, but that's actually more than roses need or can absorb. Usually they like a slightly higher nitrogen, a bit of a lower phosphorus, and a higher potassium. They also need good amounts of calcium, good amounts of magnesium and iron as well. So if you were talking about in the garden, they would be getting a good portion of that nutrition from the soil itself. But when you're doing it in containers, you take that all on yourself. So you have to look for a balanced fertilizer, I would say, with a slightly higher N, slightly higher K, and then also check to make sure it has those secondary nutrients and micronutrients in the mix. That's what I'd be recommending for container growing.
What about, what do you think about Osmocote, those kinds of things?
I think that's a great solution for containers. I mean, it's your choice how you want to fertilize, but I like those controlled release formulas like the Osmocote that you can put in, and you put in a certain amount for 4 months or 6 months. It'll tell you on the bag what's the release period, and that gives you a good baseline of nutrition on your pots. So as an example, I like the Osmocote Plus 15-9-12 product. So it's a little bit higher in that nitrogen, a little bit lower in the phosphorus, a little bit higher in the potassium. And it also contains those secondary nutrients, and it releases over that 4-month period. And then what you can do is just sort of keep an eye on how your rose is doing. And you can always top up a little bit more with a liquid feed if you need to. But I love those controlled release formulas just for the stable release over the season.
Yeah, just to keep them going. What I'm looking at right now is I've fertilized, but we have had so much rain and hard rains, and I'm thinking, so, we may have to fertilize again. We have had a little bit of flooding in the garden, and but a little harder to do out in the garden, but a little easier to control in a container. So,
yeah, you get that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, you totally have that control. And as I say, it's a double-edged sword because you have to give it all the nutrients it needs. You have to give it all the water it needs, but you get that extra control, so you can really optimize your growth.
Yes, yes. So I just mentioned water. So tell us a little bit about watering something in a container and what to watch for.
Well, you are looking for those signs of drought stress on your pot. I kind of wish that I could give people go out there, give them 5 gallons every 2 days or something like that. But the thing is, it very much depends on your climate, depends on the temperature, depends on the size of the rose and the size of the pot. So you really do have to look for those signs that there's that the roots have gone dry, and you don't have to wait for it to wilt or start losing leaves down low. Although those are the signs that it's gone a little too far into the dry end. If it's a small container, you actually can tip them out of the pot and have a look at those roots and have a look at the base and see if the soil has gone dry. But it might be useful for people to use things like moisture meters to give you sort of a baseline to keep an eye on how the moisture is going inside that pot.
What a great idea. I used to have a moisture meter and I do not have one now. So that's going on my list for sure. What a great idea. Totally forgot about those little things.
Yeah, and as for watering frequency, I guess what I would start with is to say, I try to target, if I can, watering, say, 3 times a week. Now, that may or may not be the right frequency, but if I have to do it more than that, if I'm noticing signs like the rose is having a hard time maintaining its health and growth and is looking wilted or losing those leaves, then it sounds to me like then I have too much rose for that size of pot, and I should be considering up potting it at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Well, what about sun? The sun needs of a rose in a container? Is it going to be the same that we'd have in the garden, more or less?
I'm going to say it's about the same. The only thing I would say is that if you're in a super hot climate, you may consider giving roses in containers because that soil can warm up very extremely. So you may consider giving them a spot with some afternoon shade or placing them or experimenting with where you're going to place it and trying to reduce that stress on them. One measure you can use for that is double potting. So you can have the inner plastic pot or the inner pot and then putting it into a larger ceramic pot so that the sun is not hitting that inner pot directly and not warming up that soil quite so much. But otherwise, 6+ hours of sun at a minimum, up to a full day, as long as you can manage the watering and the temperatures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everything changes kind of when we get into August. If we're getting really, really hot, we have to watch them more. But 6 hours would be great. That'll keep them blooming for sure.
And just popping back to watering for a second, because containers sometimes have either peat moss or forestry products in the soil mix, it's kind of a good idea to keep in mind that medium can become hydrophobic. So if you water, it can actually have shrunk in, and the water can go around it and saturating that soil. And it can take that water a little bit of time to percolate and integrate into that soil. So if you give them a splash of water, leave them for a bit, come back 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, give them another splash of soil, and do that repeatedly until you can verify that the soil actually does not have any big dry patches in it. That's one mistake I see people making with their watering.
That is so true. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because especially when we've been traveling or something and I wanted to train, a teenager to water the pots and that sort of thing while we were gone, the tendency is just to splash, a big gallon of water. But I've kind of mentioned to them, sort of like a sponge, it can go in portions of it, but not all. And if you don't, it has to be a slow process, because you can pull that plant out and you've got wet over here and you've got completely dry over here. It's just like it completely wicked it away. So there is a caution for the potting medium that's going to be high in those kinds of things, because it just does take a minute for that to absorb.
Yeah, and the other approach, of course, would be to put them on drip irrigation, which kind of solves that problem.
Oh, drip irrigation solves all kinds of problems. I keep telling my husband that, so I just love it when you're watching YouTube and they just snake that little tube up that pot. It's so awesome. It's just like a miracle. And I actually
perfect.
said to him, wouldn't it just be so wonderful to do that and then just get on your phone and open your app and say 2 gallons today? It's just awesome. That is definitely a miracle of gardening for sure, and success
Right on.
in gardening. So what about those growing in cold zones? Oh, we need to talk about pruning. Did we finish enough about sun?
I think we did, and if we're just talking about pruning, I mean the recommendations are the same. You're pruning for size, shape, and health. The only additional things I'll say is that when you're pruning a container rose, you may want to stay a little bit more on top of your deadheading. It does tend to be in a spot where you notice it more, and you want absolutely maximum flowering. So just staying right on top of pulling off those spent blooms. And the second thing is that one of your additional goals in pruning in a container is to manage the size so it doesn't become too demanding on the pod. So even throughout the year, if you keep on structural pruning, removing the older stems from the center of the shrub and managing down the size, it will make it a little bit more manageable for the spot and the pod.
Excellent. Luckily, many of the newer roses will say that they're sterile, which means you don't have to cut the blooms off in order for them to keep blooming, but you do to keep them pretty, I think. I still don't want, it's okay. There's a few deadheads there, here and there, but it's still, it's in a container. It's probably up and close and personal. And I think that those little tweaks just add so much to the overall look. So it's easy to do and keeps it pretty, I think.
Right. And of course, manages the health along at the same time. So you can sort of think of those two goals as the same thing, managing the health and the repeat flowering.
Yes, absolutely. Very good. So now let's talk about those of us in colder climates. It's hard to believe that you're there. I'm here in the Midwest and you're so much warmer than I am, but it's true. So, 5B, they say it's 6A now. I'm still having trouble trusting that, but so what about those growing in colder climates?
Yeah, we're basically a solid zone 8 here. So I don't have as many problems with overwintering here, but it's true no matter where you are that container roses, because the soil can freeze solid, container roses are a little more vulnerable to winter damage than those that are in the ground. They just don't have the same level of insulation. So here I may get away with just watching the forecast, and when I have a stretch of deep cold below freezing, then I can move the rose in and just put it into the garage for a day or two or for a week, as long as the coldest weather lasts. But so I would say that most roses, even those in containers, don't have a hard time, particularly with somewhere around 5 degrees Celsius or say even up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are about the same amounts below the freezing level. But if you're seeing forecasts that are much below that, they will ask or they'll benefit from a little protection. Now, of course, if you're in a much colder climate than mine, that may be a longer stretch of your winter. And in that case, I have seen people, what they do is they leave the containers out and let the roses get a little bit of cold to push them into dormancy. I'm not talking deep cold, but just a little bit of cold to push them into dormancy, strip down the foliage, do kind of an early winter pruning, and then push them inside to a minimally heated space. Something that's cold is ideal, something that still stays, not too much above freezing, but keeps them in that dormant state. And failing having a spot like that, at the very least, you should consider taking your potted roses, your container roses, and sort of bunching them up together against the house, or hilling soil over the pots is a good way to kind of provide them with that extra insulation. You even could consider a piece of fleece or agricultural fleece, rime, to go over the tops during this extreme weather.
I've done most of those things, all been successful too. What has worked the best for me is what you said, is waiting as late as I could to bring them in, cutting them back like you would, do a deep pruning. And then in our garage, it's not heated, nor is there any light, but it isn't freezing in there. So bring them in there, and for the months that they're in there, I will water them like once a month. I mean, they don't really make any headway, but they don't die. Then when March comes, they can go out for periods of time and begin to grow. And I don't think doing that I have lost any. So that works. And I know that one of my friends who doesn't have the garage to use, but she uses one of these construction blankets. And this year when she took her construction blanket off, the roses were leafed out.
Oh, wow.
So she bunches them together, puts them in the warmest spot, and then puts the blanket on them. And, they did beautifully. Now, our winters were colder years ago, it seems, but we don't trust it ever here. We always just assumed it's the Arctic and that it could happen any time, because it does. And sometimes later, just when we don't really expect it. But bringing them in, letting them be dormant, and then acclimating them back out, has certainly worked here.
Yeah, and that's just about the ideal overwintering situation. If you can manage the spot like that, and if you can't manage an indoor location, then you do your best to shelter outdoors using what you have, and hilling the soil over the pots or covering with a fabric can definitely be helpful.
Two tools that have been invaluable to me in container growing are a dolly for moving pots, and those little caddies, I think they call them. I get them off of Amazon with rollers. They're container caddies, just to move them around. That helps you chase the sun. My husband, Mr. G, he's got his tomato garden on the driveway in big pots. He's real serious about his tomatoes. But the whole driveway isn't sunny the whole day. So we've got those on those little caddies. And so we're chasing the sun sometimes, or bad weather. So having those rollers and having that caddy, those are just game changers for sure.
Well, I'm imagining the two of you out there with your various caddies and dollies pushing all your plants all over your driveway. That's pretty awesome.
I'll send you a picture. It is really.
We got to set up a time lapse or something.
It is great. 2 years ago, we had a garden, Indianapolis Rose Society came to our garden. And so the roses were great. The garden was great, but so many people were fascinated with the tomato garden in the driveway, because we lined up the tomatoes, and that's what you walked through to get to the garden. And this was in June, and the tomatoes were already very tall. Mr. G is very proud of his tomatoes. So this year we were at Rose Society, and the president of our society said, well, this isn't rose related, but I got to tell you what I'm going to do this year. I'm putting my tomatoes and a few vegetables on the driveway, just like G did. I mean, it's just the best. It's just the best. So yes, we have our dolly. Yes, we have our plant caddies. Pretty inexpensive on Amazon, but they will save your back and help you chase the sun.
Right on.
Well, let's see. One of the things I want to talk to you about was one of your videos last year. You said that you were making some additions to your farm. So how's it going?
Well, that was inspired by my trip down to Portland, the same trip that I went to Heirloom, and I stopped by the test garden there in Portland, and what an amazing scene. And I thought to myself, well, I'm getting a bunch of roses. I can set up my own little test garden in the same kind of format, not anywhere near on the same scale, but I've been doing a bit of trading and trying to get some new plants in there. So I'm setting those up, and my customers and visitors to the farm will help me to assess the new ones that I'm adding. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Oh, great. Now, did you add a cutting garden as well?
Yeah, we did some cut flowers, and we're reformatting that. We're pushing that to a different area, and we took the old cutting garden, looks like a cottage garden, and we're putting that out to minis. Once again, trying to do the test garden thing. And we've been getting lots of trades. I'm pretty happy to have gotten a couple of old Canadian roses Canadian bred roses that have not been available in the Canadian market so much. So I have Isabella Skinner, which is a climbing rose, fragrant, repeat blooming, and I think it's hardy to zone 2 or zone 3. So that's an amazing combination. And Olds College looks like a David Austin rose, but again, it's hardy to zone 3, fragrant and repeat blooming. So those two I'm quite happy to add. And then I got a whole bunch of old David Austins that we're adding to the garden this year, because I haven't ever really delved into the DA roses in a serious way. But I had a trading partner down in California who sent me just a whole bunch of cuttings, and so I've got those rooted now.
I'm so glad you have a YouTube channel so I get to see this. But now last week you did put up a YouTube of some of the roses that are blooming, and there was a peach one that I was just salivating over. It was absolutely stunning. What was the name of that?
That one's Prairie Peace, and it comes out of Rocky Mountain House, Alberta. That was where it was bred, and I got it from the daughter of the breeder. And that one is a Scots rose. It was named Prairie Peace, but the peace part was by inspiration of the peace rose, the Mélange rose. So it just has that wonderful blend of yellows and pinks, and just it's gorgeous. It's in full bloom right now. Now it is a once bloomer, so it blooms early in the season. But again, because it's from that Alberta and Canadian breeding program, it's hardy to zone 3. So this is something that anyone in any part of the country could aspire to have.
Nice. It's so pretty. And, you know, those one-time bloomers, they are just such a gift in the spring. When we're coming out of a dark winter, and it's a very special time when people say, is it worth it? It's worth it. It's right. So worth it.
I think, you know, especially depending on, I wouldn't recommend it for the people we're talking about, for container roses whose space is limited. But if you have a little bit of space, making some room for those once bloomers and old garden roses that are, you know, they tend to be a little bit bigger. They tend to be a little bit more dramatic. And so you can get a big statement out of some of those older garden roses. Absolutely.
So one more question before I let you go. When you look back at last year, and I know you're doing that, what were some of the roses or other plants in your garden that were big standouts?
You know, I add some every year, and some that came into their own last year. Lady Ash, which is a sport of aloha, and it, for some reason, to me, it just seems an even nicer color, still fragrant, beautiful glossy foliage. Everybody who walks by that right now is loving it. And I also only added this last year, a couple of years ago, Yolande d'Aragon, which is a Portland rose. So I've been enjoying that, especially with its very ornamental sepals. That's a wonderful thing to see. And it just started growing Sightsaver, which I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with. But what a standout in its first year of really showing off. I think there's something special about that rose.
Very nice. Did you say Yolande d'Aragon?
Yep.
The first time I heard of that rose was many years ago. I don't know if you're familiar with Anne Chapman. I think is she in New Zealand or Australia?
I think I've read one of her books. Yeah.
Yes. Well, she has a couple of books out, but one of them were the women in my rose garden. And she was on Rose Chat many years ago, and it was just fascinating because she would always talk about the women in her rose garden at her morning breakfast with her husband. And he said, you know, you talk about these like they're friends, you know, they're all women. And so she wrote that book, and it was a great book, but I'd never heard of that. And she told the story behind the name, behind the rose. And it's a beautiful book. And I think it's still for sale on Amazon. It's a great book, but it gives you a lot of the history. And that's one of the stories that I remember. I think was kind of tragic, but but I remember that rose from that book.
Yeah, some of those stories are.
Yeah, I still want to know them, but a lot of them are, you know, come out of something that's not exactly, you know, garden party ready. But that rose is so beautiful, so beautiful. I'm glad you have it. Well, Jason, thanks for joining me today. This has been so fun to catch up. We've got so much advice between you and my friend Dee out in Oklahoma. She's been shopping today for roses, and so I'm getting all these texts. And of course, the roses I don't have. So between the two of you, my list is just growing and growing today.
Yeah, isn't that the way it goes? My list is very long.
It's just long. And yes, our lists are long. So I'm going to look forward to the YouTube videos as they come. So take pictures of everything because we want to see them.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's so good to be with you. And friends, we're so glad you tuned in. And as you heard, growing in containers, it's not one size fits all. So whatever rose you want to grow in a container, give it a try. Maybe you heard something today that's just perfect for you. If not, maybe you'll have a good recommendation for us later. And do be sure to visit Jason's YouTube channel. It's Fraser Valley Rose Farm. You'll find excellent information there, and you'll get to see all the roses and maybe some other plants too. So friends, until next time, happy gardening.
You've been listening to the Rose Chat podcast with Chris VanCleave and Teresa Byington, expert rose gardeners who want to help you achieve the rose garden of your dreams. Don't miss an episode. Listen anytime on our website at rosechatpodcast.com or listen on the go via the Rose Chat app on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Share this podcast with your social networks and join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by using the hashtag RoseChat. Join us next time for another edition of the Rose Chat podcast. The Rose Chat podcast is a production of the Rose Chat Media Group, Birmingham, Alabama.